proceeding to a default position of a no-deal exit from the European Union? We're agreed that we must leave, we're agreed on the date, if that's conceivably possible, but do you agree that it is right that Parliament should be able to vote on a deal?
I'll say three things. A, that decision's ultimately a matter of collective responsibility, above my pay grade. Secondly, my colleague and our friend Andrew Bridgen was on the radio this morning saying that the last 2 days have seemed like 2 weeks in political terms. I think it's perfectly legitimate to say, if X, then Y, and would that lead you to do Z? Absolutely legitimate. But I think at this stage, I would not, and I don't think anyone else in my position would want to give a hostage to fortune by definitively saying, oh, I'll definitely do that. Again, for illumination. I just wanted to make sure, going back to the Chairman's earlier question, when I was asked by Andrew Marr, what might you do? I just wanted to see what the legislation was, just in order to make sure that it was compliant with existing statute and that it was compliant with existing law. It's perfectly possible for someone to say, this is a bill that we're presenting that may create all sorts of particular challenges and issues, and I wouldn't want to state definitively until I saw all the facts in front of me what I thought the wisest course would be. But anyone who knows me could infer from everything I've said in the past that I have a strong commitment to the rule of law. Anyone who knows me would infer from everything that I've done that I believe that the Prime Minister's deal is the best deal and we should do everything possible we can to get it.
And you stand firmly by your previous remarks that there is no good time of year to leave the EU without a deal?
I do, but there is also the case that however challenging aspects of no deal are, this government is working harder than ever to mitigate them, and ultimately in a choice between staying in the European Union or leaving without a deal, it is definitely better to leave, albeit without a deal, because that honours the democratic mandate of the British people. We said that we would honour the vote in the referendum. We have to do that. And of course it is the case, and we can all have a judgment about the scale or height of the bumps of the road, the extent of dislocation of leaving without a deal. But we're a strong and resilient country. We could get through that, and there are all sorts of opportunities for life outside the European Union that we could take, which would ensure that we would prosper.
If I can have one very small, tiny question, if the Minister wouldn't mind. Personally, I would accept all of that, but is there a risk that Conservative candidates in the next general election will be asked to sign a bit of paper that says, I sign up exclusively to leaving the European Union without a deal?
I don't think so. It doesn't seem at all likely to me.
Thank you.
Right, Pat McFadden.
Yes, thank you, Secretary of State. Can I take you back to your initial exchange with the Chairman about his bill? Both you and the Prime Minister have said, you today, the Prime Minister, over the last couple of days, that you'll obey the law. Can I tease this out a little bit? We now know what that bill says. It's expected to complete its stages in the House of Lords, possibly by tomorrow, who knows. But now that you've seen it, we know what it says. Does that mean complying with the terms of that bill, which, in certain circumstances, call on the government to ask for an extension to the Article 50 period?
Well, the bill hasn't yet completed its passage, and we will see, and indeed an amendment was passed last night, which raises other issues. Again, my view is properly constituted statute, passed in the right way, places an obligation on the government that believes in the rule of law to obey that statute. That's my view. Beyond that, I wouldn't want to go, because I think I could only either fuel speculation or lead people to say, oh, he's quibbling or whatever. I don't want to quibble. I want to state that clearly.
But how do we reconcile that with the Prime Minister also saying it has to be the 31st of October, do or die? Yesterday, he said that a number of times. Yesterday at Prime Minister's questions, quote unquote, I will never allow that, i.e. an extension beyond the 31st of October. So how do we reconcile a statement by you, which is governments obey the law, and if the law says whatever it says, governments must abide by it, and a statement by him that he will never apply for an extension beyond the 31st of October.
Well, it's a fair point, but I won't get into that speculation.
But how are we to make sense of these two statements? They make sense. They can't
Well,
be reconciled.
We could have a long conversation about the many ways in which they might be reconciled, but it's not for me to get into that conversation.
There are reports in some of the press today that the Prime Minister may even resign rather than do that. Is that a possibility?
I don't think the Prime Minister has any intention of resigning. He was elected in a leadership election in which I took part. He won that leadership election. He won the argument in that leadership election. He's assembled a strong team. He's made significant progress both in dealing with our European partners and also in an exciting domestic agenda, which, if you'd like me to run through, I shall. So, no.
But if he doesn't get the general election that he wants, he will have to face up to the irreconcilable statements that I've put to him. He will have to face up in the next few weeks, if the bill is passed, to either complying with it or changing the statement that he's made that he would never apply for an extension.
These are fair points for reflection, but again, to return to my role is to prepare for our departure on the 31st, which is the current legal default. I will do everything I can in order to mitigate any challenges and to maximise any opportunities from that. The broad political position that I take, I've had an opportunity to outline, and I absolutely accept the clarity of your questioning in those points, but they're not questions which I feel I can answer in my role.
Let me ask you one on a slightly different point, which is your direct responsibility about no deal. If we leave the EU on the 31st of October without a deal in place, is that a lasting state? Is that something that could continue for some years? Is it an end point?
It's theoretically possible that it could continue for some years, but I don't believe it's an end point. So it is theoretically possible that the UK could continue to trade with the EU as a third country on WTO terms for some time. It's also possible that some of the other arrangements that are part and parcel of EU membership would fall away and not be replaced. But I think most people, certainly I think, that following on from the point that Stephen Kinnock made, that whether or not we moved quickly to negotiations under Article 218, or whether there were other conversations that occurred, that we would not be in that situation forever. There are perfectly legitimate arguments made by respectable and thoughtful economists that WTO terms, strictly in economic terms, might be an advantage. My own view is that seeking a free trade agreement, a best-in-class free trade agreement with the European Union, is in both our interests. And ultimately, in the same way as we want to have free trade agreements with Australia, the United States, New Zealand and others, so we should seek to have a free trade agreement with Europe. And it's also the case that because of other interests that we have, security, education, science and so on, that we should seek to have agreements in those areas as well.
So no deal is not an end point?
No deal is, again, without wanting to go back to my earlier question, no deal is never an end point in the sense that the EU will change, the UK will change, but I think you're absolutely right to hone in on the fact that if we leave without a deal, that brings a degree of assurance and certainty in some areas against which we can plan, but it's also the case that conversations can then go on about how we can build a better relationship in the future.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan Ginogly.
Thank you, Chairman. Minister.
There are tens of thousands of small UK businesses that are not VAT registered. that will need to get an EORI number, an Economic Operators Registration and Identification number, before 31st of October. What is the government doing to ensure that they do so?
Those businesses that are below the VAT threshold?
Yes.
Yes. We're communicating through the business information campaign that we launched earlier this week in order to say to every business that exports to the EU that you need an EORI number. Now, as you'll appreciate, we don't know the precise number of businesses that are in that position, but given where the VAT threshold is, it's not a massive number of businesses, but we want to make sure that every business in this country has what it requires in order to be ready. The EORI number, if you do export to the EU, is a necessary but not sufficient tool to continue exporting.
Right, so I understand that some 240,000 businesses will require the EORI number. Do you know how many have applied for it so far?
Yes, well, I think it is the case that we know definitively that there are around 150,000 businesses which are VAT registered and which trade with the EU but not beyond it. The number of businesses below the VAT threshold, we can't know perfectly. It's an informed guesstimate. Of the 150,000, we had north of 60,000 who'd registered, and then we authorised that the additional businesses that had not yet registered should receive that number automatically. So they should now or have or be in the process of getting that number.
Thank you. And can you clarify whether businesses will need both a UK and an EORI number in the event of a no-deal Brexit?
It depends whether or not they export from the UK into the EU or both export from the UK into the EU and from the EU into the UK. If your company exports from the EU into the UK, so your goods are on the market here, you will need an EU EORI number.
So the government advice online is that EORI numbers will not be necessary for moving goods between Northern Ireland to Ireland under no deal. Does the EU share that view?
The EU has been reticent about a number of aspects of what may happen in the event of no deal between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And that's for reasons which are understandable given its own internal politics. We would obviously like the EU and the Republic of Ireland to be in a position where they can say more.
But you can't say any more at the moment as to how you're going to move that forward.
Every business that exports to the EU, including businesses that export to the Republic of Ireland, would be well advised to get an EORI number. We're issuing EORI numbers to every company, as I mentioned, every organisation that's in that position that is VAT registered.
And Chairman, if I may, you spoke about the assessment of delays going from the UK to Calais, or actually in the UK. But I'd just like to ask slightly from the other side, the French side.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Yellowhammer set out various planning assumptions. One was France will impose EU mandatory controls on UK goods on day one of no deal, and there's built infrastructure. On day one of no deal, 50 to 85% of HGVs travelling via the short straits may not be ready for French customs. The lack of trader readiness combined with limited space in French ports to hold unready HGVs could reduce the flow rate to 40 to 60% of current levels within one day. So what is your planning assumption now of how French customs will react?
Okay, helpful question, and it gives me an opportunity to revisit an earlier point that the Chairman made. In the Yellowhammer document, it says, what is our base scenario, as in what do we expect will be unalterable facts? And the base scenario, or facts that we know are givens. So the base scenario is, if we leave, then we're a third country, trading on WTO terms, and the base scenario is also that the EU will impose, for example, sanitary and phytosanitary checks. So that's the base. These are facts that until either the EU or the French state changes them are the basis on which you can then make a judgment about what a likely or reasonable worst case scenario is. So it's important to distinguish between the two. The base, the agreed facts, which are unambiguous. The reasonable worst case, looking at those facts, what we think, given the state of preparedness, is a scenario against which we should judge. Having visited Calais last Friday, it's clear to me that at the moment, the EU will require all vehicles that arrive at Calais to be compliant both in SPS and in customs terms. However, without wanting to depart from that fact, it is also the case that French politicians, Xavier Bertrand, who's the president of the France region, and Mr. Darmanin, who's the equivalent of Rishi Sunak in the French government, they both said that they wanted to be as pragmatic as possible. So I don't want to get anyone's hopes up unnecessarily, but it is the case that there is a political willingness on the French side. If that political willingness results in a change to how those checks will be applied, then the base scenario will change because those specific facts will change. And to go back to your point about the 40 to 60%, that was based on an assessment both of trader readiness and of traffic flow. And if you get a higher level of trader readiness, then that worst case scenario can be changed. I'm sorry to go on at such length, but it's important for me to try to be as transparent, well, to be transparent with the committee, because people, for understandable reasons, sometimes say base, worst, and all the rest of it. I'm trying really to put it all in context so that people can recognise again, to go back to it in a nutshell, no deal, significant challenges, but we're seeking to mitigate.
I understand, Secretary of State, that in relation to France, you can't say this is what's going to happen.
No,
I fully understand that. I think what people will want to know is that you've got the processes in place with the French.
Yes.
And the relationships in place with the French.
Oh, yes.
So that when these things that you're saying could be, that we can adapt and move quickly.
Oh, yes.
And perhaps you could just explain a little bit about what is set up between the UK and France, so that we can move quickly when we have to adapt.
Yes. Well, the fruits of the visit from last Friday were that Mr. Darmanin said that the French and the UK government would cooperate in advance of October the 31st to model and deal with the testing of systems in the event of a no-deal scenario. I had the opportunity to visit the new berths and booths that would be used in order to make sure you had the maximum flow of lorries. I had a chance to see the French system, which means that if everything is compliant well before you reach the port of Dover, you can have absolute confidence that your consignment can go through. I also saw the fact that there's a specific slip road, as it were, for fish and shellfish, which arrive in Calais to go straight to Boulogne, where the border inspection post is for the Boulogne market, so they can be freshly sold. So the French have done a lot, and we have committed to stay closely in touch to see what more we can do in order to mitigate any problems that arise.
Okay, thank you. So can I just check one thing? You used the phrase base scenario.
Yes.
Now, I did ask you at the beginning of this session whether the words base case or base scenario appeared in the Operation Yellowhammer report, and I think you said no.
Yes.
Do you want to revisit that?
Yes, that was the reason why I mentioned it, that there is a difference between base scenario and base case. So I will try and explain again.
But all I need for the moment, because you explained it in answer to Jonathan, but the words base scenario do appear in the Yellowhammer report. So you're correcting what you said earlier. No, that's fine.
Absolutely.
Just for the clarification. Very helpful. Right, Joanna Cherry.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chancellor. Stephen Crabb asked you whether there are genuine negotiations going on between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and you said that you knew that there were, and mentioned that David Frost, the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, and a third person from the Prime Minister's office was involved.
The Prime Minister himself.
The Prime Minister himself. Can you tell us who the EU counterparts are that are involved in these negotiations?
Yes. Well, obviously the counterpart for the Prime Minister will be the heads of state, because he's at the moment, heads of government of the EU member states. It is the case that my understanding is that I'm not involved in those negotiations, but that the role that had been played in the past in negotiations by certain members of the Commission has now been taken on by Stephanie Rizzo. And it is the case that Secretary of State Barclay's principal interlocutor would be Michel Barnier until that changes. But it is, of course, the case that, by definition, David Frost, as the Prime Minister's Sherpa, will talk to the Sherpas in other member states. So those could be people in the Prime Minister's office in the Republic of Ireland or in Spain. And, of course, Steve is has visited other EU member states on a very regular basis, and he'll talk to a range of politicians there. So, for example, Steve, when he visits the Irish Republic, will talk to the Taoiseach.
So Michel Barnier is involved in negotiations with the United Kingdom at present. Is that your position?
No. I think it is the case that a web of negotiations go on, but if one's talking about the I was about to say titular, the real equivalence, but then the opposite numbers. Let me give you, I suppose, a case in point. My direct opposite number in the House of Commons is John Trickett, but it might well be the case that in the course of the conversations that we have, that I'll be having a conversation with Keir Starmer or with Sue Hayman about particular aspects of my portfolio in which they have a legitimate interest.
But as I understand it, the previous negotiations were conducted either by the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union or the previous Prime Minister with Monsieur Barnier. There are no such negotiations going on at the moment, no negotiations between the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union and Michel Barnier, is that correct?
Most of the time, the negotiations that went on under when Theresa was Prime Minister were conducted by representatives of Task Force 50, while Michel Barnier was, of course, the Commission's principal negotiator, a lot of those negotiations were carried on by a very talented Commission official called Sabine Whale, with Oliver Robbins, who was the Prime Minister's Europe advisor in the Cabinet Office. Nothing is precisely identical, but essentially the role that Oliver Robbins was played is now being played by David Frost. And my understanding, though I'm not involved in these conversations, is that Sabine Whale is moving on, that she is likely to be a DG in Ursula von der Leyen's new commission, and that the role that was played by Sabine Whale will be played by Stephanie Rizzo. I think that is right.
So are there
but if I've got any of that wrong, then I'll write to let you know.
But are there any negotiations going on directly with Stephanie Rizzo?
My understanding, again, I'm not involved, my understanding is that David Frost has been talking to people in the Commission, and Stephanie Rizzo is, I believe, his principal interlocutor.
But talking to people in the Commission is very different from conducting negotiations. I'm trying to establish who the counterparts are in the negotiations to which you referred.
There are teams on either side. I don't know the full composition of either team.
Yesterday, at Prime Minister's Questions, the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield asked the Prime Minister why it has proved impossible in the course of the current legal proceedings in Scotland, in which I am a petitioner and a number of other parliamentarians and the government are the respondent. Mr. Grieve asked why it has proved impossible to find any official or minister prepared to state that the reasons for the prorogation were to pave the way for a Queen's speech. Now, the Prime Minister didn't answer the question. Are you prepared to answer that question? Well,
again, all I can say is that I'm aware that there's live proceedings at the Court of Session. B, that there will have been legal advice that the Prime Minister and others will have received that I have not seen. I wholeheartedly support the Prime Minister's decision, but I was not involved in the prior decision-making process, so it wouldn't be fair for me to say anything in that, because I've made mistakes in the past, but I would be blundering into legal territory where I wouldn't provide any clarity for anyone.
Is it true that both Nicky da Costa, the Director of Legislative Services, and Mark Sedwell, the Cabinet Secretary, have refused to sign witness statements for the Scottish proceedings for fear of having to either perjure themselves or tell a truth that would be damaging to the government?
I have absolutely no idea. I haven't asked either of them about that, so I wouldn't have can.
I'm just wondering whether we're straying into an area that's before the court, and we shouldn't be doing that.
I haven't heard anything that is disorderly since, as Joanna has pointed out, these issues were raised in the House yesterday, and the Speaker didn't rule them disorderly. I don't see why they could be disorderly today.
Thank you.
But please carry on.
I've been advised, Chancellor, by a number of reliable sources that the key figures in number 10 and the government are communicating about the real reasons for prorogation through unofficial channels, that is to say personal emails, WhatsApp and burner phones. To your knowledge, is that true?
No, a burner phone.
Yeah, that's a phone that's quite often used by a drug dealer, which can't be tracked. Phones which can't be tracked by the authorities or by the courts because they're used once and then thrown away.
All news to me.
Okay. If you were asked to provide an affidavit for the courts as to the reasons for the prorogation, that's obviously evidence or testimony sworn on oath, would you be prepared to do so?
I wasn't involved in the decision. I supported it when we were told about it, or rather, when the strategy was outlined to the Cabinet and the reason behind it was outlined. So I don't imagine that I could provide more information that was material other than that which the Cabinet had. But again, one of the things that I would say is that when dealing with these issues, as a minister, I would always want to have the advice of the Attorney General about what I should or shouldn't do, because I'd want to follow the ministerial code, adhere to the rule of law, and take his advice.
When were the Cabinet advised of the plan to prorogue Parliament?
I think the date's in the public domain. I can't recall it off the top of my head.
Can you confirm that date for us after this evidence session in writing, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Craig McKinley.
Thank you very much, Chancellor. As you'll be aware, there are a number of little side deals, mini deals, making things flow in from both sides.
Absolutely.
That the European Parliament has agreed. I would suggest that after today, you've got one other job. It's the mutual recognition of pallets. I'd hate to see Brexit abandoned because of pallets.
I think we're probably okay on the pallet front, notwithstanding the point that the chairman made.
Yes. I'd love to see the arrangements on the Polish-Belarus border, whether they're that bothered about pallets, but there, we'll put that aside. Let's just go back to the food issue.
Yep.
Because, this is part of the fear that we've been hearing, higher food prices and delays and shelves looking like something out of a Cuban supermarket, of which I've visited. I don't actually believe any of it. Let's look at a particular product and a particular country that is really reliant on UK exports, and that would be the Spanish producers. Often they produce out-of-season cucumbers, lettuces, short-dated, very much short-dated. Obviously they produce citrus that we don't produce for ourselves. So quite interesting to note that the EU external tariff on cucumbers, 12.8%. I don't actually know of any other country that we import from that's not an EU country. So I don't suppose many of those tariffs are ever raised. But let's just think of that Spanish lettuce or cucumber grower. He has a regular market with one of the major UK supermarkets.
Yep.
By default, he obviously hasn't got a market elsewhere, otherwise he wouldn't be selling to us now. Can't suddenly increase the consumption of cucumbers in Germany to make up for any that he's not selling in the UK. Now, I would have thought it will be within our will, should we so wish, to not apply the EU external tariff on cucumbers, and I believe we can do that instantly and temporarily, subject to WTO approval. But given our demand would be for a 0% tariff on Spanish cucumbers, even if we were a third country, I can't imagine the WTO would complain about that, because that is, at the end of the day, their raison d'etre. So let's just analyse this Spanish grower. He'll have a local haulier that does a regular run up to Britain. So we've taken away the tariff. The man wants to sell to us because it's a regular market that he's reliant upon. The haulier does a regular run that he's reliant on. Where in any of that scenario, given that at Dover we're not going to start stopping that within our gift and not stop that lorry and take it apart any more now than we would in the future, where is the higher food in that process? Because I'm struggling to see it.
It's a brilliant and very helpful analysis. The one challenge is the one the chairman identified earlier, which is that if it is the case that lots of lorries from the UK carrying our exports were to get to Dover and they weren't to have the documentation and they were then to go over and they were to be held up, then that would mean that the flow back onto the lorries, back onto the ferries coming to the UK would be, the pipe would be narrower as a result. And if you had that big time, you could potentially have delays as the Spanish lorries, while they're desperate to get on, have to wait until the British lorries are sent back. That's why we're doing everything we can to make sure that UK hauliers, EU hauliers and UK companies know what they need. If they have what they need, there is no reason why there should be disruption. That's why the the best case scenario is no delay at all.
I mean, I would imagine that haulier, that Spanish haulier,
Yeah.
I know the haulage business, it operates on very, very skinny margins across the whole of the EU. There will be desperation because that lorry's got to get back to Spain and then perhaps haul over to Germany.
Yes.
So there would be outrage, and the whole of the logistics industry of the whole of the EU would be affected if the French, for whatever reason, created that bottleneck at Calais, Dover.
Yeah. Well, again, 3/4, it's actually slightly more than that, of hauliers who operate in the UK come from the EU, principally but not exclusively from countries like Poland and Romania. So there's a shared interest that the EU have and its member states have in keeping things going. So even if, for some reason, there was inefficiency, which I don't imagine there would be at Calais, I think one would find that Spanish vegetable growers, Polish hauliers, Romanian exporters would all be saying, look, please, 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 can we make sure that this operates more effectively? Absolutely.
To go back to something you covered in very great detail, it was very helpful. And this is the clearance, what are the numbers? EORI numbers.
Yeah.
People who haven't quite complied with everything, they might have to go up the amber lane in Calais. I've been involved with the Operation Brock meetings that we have on a regular basis with South East MPs and the appropriate ministers. Now, it felt, I had one yesterday, it felt that there was more of a sense of readiness before the 29th of March than I was sensing yesterday. And that blockage seemed to be HMRC. In arranging pre-clearance sites. They didn't seem to have got those really bound down just yet. The number of staff that they'll need to run those. It felt that everything had been rather candid in aspect for 6 months. And they're suddenly getting used to it again. Using the facilities of your department, can you please put a rocket under HMRC to make sure they do what they need to do at this time? And what's your experience of how they're managing at the moment?
Well, you're absolutely right. This is a matter of profound interest to Kent MPs and Kent residents, so I can completely understand why you want to raise it, and you are right that we do need to make sure that we're operating as quickly as we can. There should be 6 transit sites, 5 in Kent, 1 in North Weald in Essex. Things are absolutely on track for 4 of them. There are 2 that have fallen slightly behind. That doesn't mean that they're totally off track. We should have assurance in the next few days that everything is on course with them, and all the appropriate steps are being taken now by HMRC in order to make sure that those transit sites are up and running and ready for October the 31st. And to be fair, no one has been more energetic in seeking to make this happen than Jim Hara, the current number 2 at HMRC, who he and his team have been working incredibly hard to deliver whatever, what's the word? Reasons for a certain delay there might have been with HMRC in the past, and it's nothing to do with HMRC staff, it's decisions that are made elsewhere. The political decisions have now been made, and the HMRC staff are working incredibly hard to deliver.
And just to pick up on something that Peter Bowden raised earlier on, I know we've been on different sides of this. You were willing, with reluctance or otherwise, to accept the Theresa May deal. I wasn't under any circumstance. Have you ever understood the basis of the £39 billion as part of that deal? I've done my own calculations, and I could sort of see we were part of the multi-annual financial framework till 2020. I could sort of see a moral basis for that, because we were around the table when it was negotiated and all the rest of it. But I've really struggled to get to that £39 billion. Have you analysed it for yourself, and are you comfortable with it, given, of course, what the House of Lords' own report said a couple of years ago, saying, well, in international law, that perhaps there is nothing to pay?
I have had a look. I can't claim to have had the closest look in comparison to some in the Treasury. I think it is certainly the case that if we leave without a withdrawal agreement, there is a legitimate case for saying that the amount that we would give would be less than had been previously thought, and the way in which we would pay might be different from that which had been conceived. But these are negotiating matters for the PM, the Chancellor, and Steve Barclay to decide. But it is perfectly intellectually legitimate and respectable to say that in the absence of the withdrawal agreement having been signed, that you can kick the tires on those figures.
Just very finally, you're far more of an expert on constitutional procedural matters than I. we have possibly by tomorrow afternoon this number 6 bill that we had great fun with yesterday afternoon. That could become the law of the land by tomorrow afternoon. Now, say there is a general election at the date that we would prefer on the 15th of October, and the Queen's speech wouldn't come around until about the 21st. That would be very troublesome to have that number 6 bill in the Prime Minister's pocket, and he has to comply with that when he goes to the Council of Ministers meeting on, where are we then? Was it the 17th?
Yeah, exactly.
17th. Would it be possible for a new Parliament to repeal that before he goes to that meeting? Because otherwise, that meeting becomes something of a waste of time.
It would be possible for a new Parliament to repeal it. I don't know about the timescale.
Okay, that's very helpful. Vera Hobhouse. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chancellor. I'm an EU migrant, as is well known, and for obvious reasons I stay very close to organisations who represent the 3.4 million EU citizens. And can I assure you that the hurt that has been caused in that community over the last 3 years is immeasurable? And can I first of you ask you, will you accept that there is a high human cost for all EU citizens who have been living in limbo for the last 3 years and who continue to do this by all their flip-flopping of this government?
Well, I completely accept that there has been uncertainty for some and disappointment for others at different points over the course of the last few years. But let me take this opportunity to reinforce, as I did, as I had the chance to in the House of Commons, that EU citizens who live in the UK are our friends, our neighbours, our family members, and we must do everything possible to safeguard your and other EU citizens or EU nationals' rights in this country, that the settlement scheme that has been put in place is designed to do exactly that, that broadly 1 million people have been granted status so far, some full settled status, some pre-settled status, and without wanting to make any criticism of any other EU member state, the guarantees that the UK has given EU citizens are more certain and more generous than that offered by a significant number of EU member states to UK nationals. And that's why I asked in the House of Commons 2 days ago if member states would be able to reciprocate. The position across member states varies. There are political constraints in different member states. But one of the things that I would also say is that right at the very beginning of the negotiation process, indeed in the immediate aftermath of the referendum, I was one of a number of politicians, including our current Prime Minister, who said that there should be no circumstances under which the position of EU citizens in the UK should be rendered uncertain or made a bargaining chip.
I mean, I would say it's worth reiterating that the uncertainty is caused by this country wanting to leave the European Union and not the other way around. I mean, I'm a British citizen and have been for many years, so I'm sort of okay, but the feeling of being in limbo continues, and no matter what this government is saying, it continues. So can I just ask, the Home Office published a new paper on EU citizens yesterday. So what will EU citizens arriving after the 31st of October 2019 have to do to be able to stay and work in the UK?
Well, they can apply for European temporary leave to remain, and that will mean that that application having been granted, they will have all the freedoms and access to services and the ability to work and study that one would expect.
But how will border control officers or employers or landlords be able to distinguish between those who turn up with their European passports, whether they have been actually arriving after the 31st or whether they've been living in this country for many years?
Well, everyone who has been living in this country for many years and who would like to apply for settled status, and I would encourage everyone to do so because their presence here is valuable. It's a relatively straightforward process, though there have been one or two administrative hiccups.
But how will a border officer distinguish between those who have settled status and those who have come here after the 31st of October? How will they do that?
There wouldn't be any need for the border individual to do so. There's a distinction between someone who can say, I've been here for a number of years and this is the evidence, we can look at the evidence, wonderful, settled status can be granted and we're reassured, and the way in which someone, until we have a new immigration bill in place, someone coming from the EU would come to this country. We're not imposing visa or other requirements, but we are saying that if someone who comes from the EU wants to ensure that they have the capacity to remain and potentially to go on to a route towards citizenship later, that they should apply for European temporary leave to remain.
You will have heard the story of my constituent who has actually been living here for over 30 years and applied for settled status and wasn't granted it, only pre-settled status. So the whole operation doesn't seem to work very well. And will you confirm again that the in limbo situation for the EU citizens, whether they're here or coming after the 31st of October, is very high?
No, I absolutely take the point. And as with any system, any computer system run by government or by the private sector, there will be occasions, inevitably be occasions, where an individual who has put in a properly constituted application, for whatever reason, the system may not respond to that appropriately. When that happens, that's wrong. We should move quickly to put it right. But it is the case that if people have the appropriate evidence of their residency here over that appropriate period, and they are EU citizens, then the granting of settled status or pre-settled status should be relatively straightforward. It is the case, as I say, that 1 million people out of the 3.4 have applied for status. The overwhelming majority who've applied have been granted status. There are one or two reasons why they might not be granted, potentially to do with past criminality, and there might be a reason why someone is not yet granted the status to which they're entitled, which may well be that the evidence that they present, for whatever reason, it hasn't been presented in the right way or hasn't been processed in the right way. But overall, I think that the offer is generous, the intent is sincere, and the operation of the system has been driven by civil servants and ministers who are absolutely determined to make it as efficient as possible.
Can I tell you this? The system doesn't work. My constituent had his his settled status not accepted. The Home Office was meant to ring him last Monday and it didn't. But I leave it here.
I apologise to your constituent for the distress that they may have faced, and I will of course raise with the Home Secretary the specific case in order to make sure that we work with...
There will be thousands like him, and only because he's a high-profile case, and now the Home Office is doing something about it, there will be thousands and thousands living in limbo.
The numbers are in question, but I do take your point.
Thank you.
Well, I've just had whispered in my ear a suggestion. Is there or could there be an MP's hotline to raise these particular cases? We have been waiting to take evidence from a Home Office minister, but one has not been identified as available before the prorogation. Is that something you could take back?
I certainly will.
Right, that's very helpful. Stephen Timms.
Thank you. Chair, can I go back to a couple of points that we've already covered? We took evidence yesterday from the Freight Transport Association, which told us that long delays at Dover for trucks wanting to go to Calais were inevitable if we left the EU without a deal on the 31st of October. Are you confident that they are mistaken about that?
I don't think they're inevitable, but they are a material risk.
The reason they explain to us that it's inevitable is really two things. One is that, as the Chair said earlier, there are 300 spaces in the lorry park at Calais, which lorries will have to go through if they go into the amber lane. And secondly, that a significant proportion of the trucks coming to Dover will not, initially at least, have full customs documentation. I think we've talked about 40 to 60% being the customs expectation. Absolute minimum, we were told, this was the HMRC view as of June, is at least 20% will be turning up without Oxford. So I think it's 10,000 trucks a day, isn't it? So you've got 2,000 trucks a day going through that amber lane into 300 spaces. So what will happen, we were told, is that once the 300 spaces are full, the Calais authorities will stop further ferries coming from Dover, and then the lorries will back up along the motorway. So that's the account they gave to us, why they think long delays are inevitable. What's the flaw in their argument from your point of view?
Well, there's no flaw in the argument. It is a worst case scenario. But the two things that I would...
Sorry, why is it worst case? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Because there are at least two things that can be done to alter the assumption that 20% of lorries will arrive at Dover without documentation necessary. And they are making sure that hauliers and firms know what is required and take action to make sure that they have that documentation. And the number of people getting ready is increasing, as the Bank of England, in a very different context, acknowledged yesterday. And then the second thing is, even for those who are not compliant, doing everything possible to ensure that they don't actually reach Dover. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, the Department for Transport has introduced statutory instruments this week in order to ensure that people who are heading towards Dover, who are not compliant, can be turned away until they are.
What is the current HMRC assessment of the minimum proportion of trucks turning up at Dover who will not have adequate documentation?
Well, that's exactly what we're seeking to do at the moment. One of the things that I mentioned earlier, right at the very beginning when we're talking about the assumptions underpinning Yellowhammer, is that there are two things: trader readiness, traffic management. What we're trying to do is to deal with both of those, get a higher level of trader readiness, have a more sophisticated form of traffic management, and that we hope will reduce the incidence. But the one thing that I would say is that we've always got to plan for a reasonable worst-case scenario. So it is perfectly possible to say, on the basis of everything we know, the chances of a worst-case scenario appear to be diminishing, but we've still got to prepare for that worst-case scenario. And then the other thing is we can also say, even if that worst-case scenario materialises, we don't think it will be quite as bad because of these other factors. So one of the things that I want to do is to share with this committee and with Parliament as much as possible about the way in which we make these judgments, as much as possible about the judgments that exist, and as much as possible about the mitigations that we're putting in place, so that you can hold me to account for saying X or Y intervention will clearly make it better. You've said that you should be doing it. Why aren't you doing more of it?
Can I just press you on this point about the HMRC assessment? Because what we were told yesterday was that in June, the HMRC assessment was that I think 40 or 60% of trucks turning up at Dover won't have the full documentation.
Yes.
Absolute minimum, 20%.
Yes.
What is the current HMRC assessment for those figures?
It is being revised at the moment, but you're absolutely correct. That was the judgment at June.
So that is the most recent HMRC assessment, is it?
I'm not sure it's the most recent. I think that there have been 3 iterations, and I'm not sure if that was the second or the third, but I'll come back to you because it is being revised at the moment.
You see why it seems inevitable. If you've got 2,000 lorries going into 300 spaces in Calais, we've got a problem, and the problem will be very clear on day one.
Completely. But the part of one of the many merits of Yellowhammer, one of the many merits of this work, is that when you see a problem coming, you can try to take steps to deal with it. Now, those steps may be ineffective or they may be highly effective. I very much hope it's the latter. But you're absolutely right that the haulage industry, HMRC and others have correctly identified what the challenge will be if mitigation is not put in place. Mitigation can be put in place, and it's my responsibility to try to do everything possible to do that.
So you can certainly see why the Freight Transport Association is saying that long delays are inevitable.
I can see why they're worried, and the one thing that I would say is, unless mitigation takes place.
There's no sign that we've seen of that mitigation taking place at present. If there is an update that we can be given, that would be very helpful.
Well,
can I just, the other question I wanted to ask you about was something you said earlier about data adequacy. And you recognise there will be, if we leave the EU without a deal, there will be a period after the 31st of October when we do not have a data adequacy determination.
Yes.
How long would you expect that gap to be before we get one?
Well, it's difficult to know. On the one hand, one would hope that it would be relatively rapid because, as I say, Crown dependencies have data adequacy even though they're outside the EU. On the other hand, the EU machinery has often been slow in granting data adequacy in the past. The third thing, as I think Joe Cherry will know, is that there are, because of the Schrems judgment and other factors, this is a politically charged area within the EU. All that having been said, companies can take steps through in order to reduce the concern. When you say
relatively rapid, what would count as relatively rapid in your view for getting this sorted?
Weeks.
You would hope we'd get a data adequacy determination within weeks?
I can't know, that's the thing, because it's a sovereign decision of the EU. I can make the argument, I can explain why I think it's in everyone's interests. Other people who are involved in the negotiations can make that case. Things may move, But again, my responsibility, I hope, towards this committee is to offer a view of what I hope could happen, but also to be clear about what may.
Yeah. You've made the point earlier that the alternative is for companies to introduce standard contractual clauses in their clauses. You'll know, I'm sure, the evidence from Tech UK that larger businesses, on the whole, have done that, and smaller businesses haven't, because it is quite a costly thing to do, to renegotiate all your contracts with your business partners and so on. So Tech UK has been surveying its members in the last few weeks, and they found that among smaller businesses, 53% had taken no active steps to prepare for no deal, mostly because they're unable to predict the implications of no deal. So you'd recognise, wouldn't you, that for small businesses, they, on the whole, they will not have these standard contractual clauses, and they will face very serious difficulties.
I think two points. It's a very, very fair analysis. Two things that I'd say are, one, it is the case, you are right, that as a general rule, larger businesses are more ready than smaller businesses. But the process of agreeing standard contractual clauses can be done relatively quickly. There is guidance on the Information Commissioner's website. There's guidance on the new gov.uk/Brexit set of pages about how to do so. So again, if action is taken promptly by businesses in the next 2 weeks, then these clauses can be put in place.
But it is a lengthy and complicated process to renegotiate all of your contracts with lots of different business partners. It's not a simple exercise.
It need not be, and again, it's unlikely to be the case. So I'd be grateful for the evidence that it would be it's not the most pleasant way to spend some of your time if you're a business person. I would freely grant that, but it is not an insuperable obstacle.
Just one final question, if I may, Chair. The government has been giving business readiness grants to some organisations like Tech UK and other business support organisations so they can support their members in their preparations. Those grants at the moment are due to run out on the 31st of October. There'd be quite a strong case, wouldn't there, for continuing those grants, particularly if we leave with no deal on 31st October, into November and beyond, in order that those organisations can continue to support their members through what is likely to be a difficult period.
Yes, and indeed expanding them.
And?
Expanding them.
Is the government going to be expanding them?
At the moment, we're reviewing a range of measures that we can take in order to further enhance business readiness, yes.
Okay,
thank you very much.
Peter Grant.
Thanks, Chair. Could I go back to your comment from earlier on, Minister? The Prime Minister's view that we can surgically excise the backstop. Now, the Prime Minister wrote to Donald Tusk on the 19th of August, saying in terms that the UK can no longer continue to endorse the specific commitment in paragraph 49 of the December 2017 joint report. In effect, that tears up the agreed joint report of December 2017, certainly the parts of what that relate to relations between the UK, Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland. Other than ongoing discussions with the Democratic Unionist Party, what discussions were there with anyone else in Ireland before the UK announced their intention to resolve from that agreement?
Well, I have been involved in the Cabinet committee that deals in the broad terms of negotiations, but I haven't been involved in those negotiations. So that's more properly a question for the Exit Secretary, the Prime Minister or the Foreign Secretary.
What reaction have you had from the Government of Ireland to that letter?
I personally haven't. But I'm looking forward to seeing the Taoiseach and other representatives of the Irish political parties and others at the British Irish Association in Cambridge this weekend.
Right. Would it be your expectation that they would welcome that backtracking with open arms? Would you expect them to have concerns about it?
I wouldn't want to speculate about the views of politicians in another jurisdiction for whom I have enormous respect. They will speak for themselves.
Well, Minister, your Cabinet colleagues are always only too happy in the Chamber to speculate about the way in which politicians in other countries will simply keel over and give the United Kingdom everything it wants. That seems to be what the Leave campaign have been saying for the last 5 years. But still, would you understand if the Irish government, and indeed political parties and others in Ireland, felt let down or even insulted that the United Kingdom should unilaterally announce its intention to withdraw from an agreement which incidentally was made only with the explicit approval of the DUP to begin with? The DUP vetoed the original version of that and had to be changed. Would you understand if various interested parties in both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland felt they had been let down, or even felt it was extremely discourteous for the United Kingdom to take a decision to unilaterally withdraw from that agreement without bothering to tell anyone on the island where it is most applicable?
I'm sure that politicians, both in the Republic of Ireland and from different traditions and parties in Northern Ireland, will have views and will communicate those views. As I say, I want to work pragmatically with politicians on both sides of the border in order to deal with the consequences if we do leave without a deal, and in order to ensure that when we get a deal that we can work in the interests of all the citizens of these islands. So I won't criticise any politician who may want to make a particular argument, not least because I'm not involved in those negotiations.
Right. The letter eventually makes specific proposals. As far as I can see, it's the only specific proposals the UK has made to the EU. One of them is from the Prime Minister. I propose that the backstop should be replaced with a commitment to put in place such arrangements as far as possible before the end of the transition period as part of the future relationship. The commitment that the UK want to result from in paragraph 49 of his joint report remains committed to protecting North-South cooperation and to its guarantee of avoiding a hard border. Any future arrangements must be compatible with these overarching requirements. There's no difference between the commitment that the UK is wanting to withdraw from and the commitment that it's now seeking to make, is it? Apart from the fact that the original agreement of 2017 gave explicit consequences should these alternative arrangements either not work or not exist. So isn't it the fact that all that the UK is asking to do is to make the same commitment that they made in 2017 and failed to keep, but to drop any consequences of failing to keep to the promises?
I don't think so, no.
So what are the consequences if the commitment that the Prime Minister is proposing to make in his latest letter, what are the consequences if that commitment is not kept? Perhaps it can help you if an almost identical commitment was made in 2017. The contingency, if the UK failed to honour that commitment, was what came to be known as a backstop.
Yes.
So can I put it to you that what the United Kingdom is seeking to do is to make the same commitment that it has failed to keep over the last 2 years, but is asking the Europeans, and the Irish in particular, to drop any safety net, any protection, any guarantee of continued compliance with the Good Friday agreements in the event that the UK continues to do what it's always done, which is to fail to comply with its own commitments.
I now get to the nub of your question. It is certainly the case that those who designed and argued for the backstop believed that the provisions of the backstop were a way of protecting the gains since the Belfast Agreement was concluded. But the backstop as designed is not the only way in which you can ensure that the Belfast Agreement is met, and indeed there are sincere advocates of the Belfast Agreement who've expressed their concerns about the provisions contained within the backstop as it stands, and no one would suggest that either Lord Murphy of Torfaen or Lord Alderdice or Lord Trimble were anything other than sincere advocates of peace. Lord Trimble, of course, received a Nobel Peace Prize for his role in helping to conclude the Belfast Agreement, but Lord Trimble has written and outlined his concerns about the way in which the backstop is not the perfect way to maintain the principles and the letter of the Belfast Agreement. Now, people can legitimately differ from Lord Trimble, but nobody could say that Lord Trimble was an unrespectable or marginal figure in the debate about how we can best make sure that the Belfast Agreement is secured.
One final question, if I may. There have been repeated doubts raised, in fact I think this committee on at least 2 occasions, one of them I think when you may still have been a member, has reported that we couldn't see how the government's previous red lines, which are still there, could be compatible with requirements of the Good Friday Agreement. Now, given that the Prime Minister is now asking to replace the backstop with a commitment to put in place such arrangements as far as possible, not now, not by the 31st of October, but before the end of the transition period, clearly if the Prime Minister thought those arrangements existed today, he would say we'll put them in place today. So the Prime Minister is accepting that suitable arrangements don't exist today, will not exist on the 31st of October. If we leave without a deal on the 31st of October, there are no arrangements in place to make the management of Northern Ireland compatible with the Good Friday Agreement, are there?
Well, it is a huge question.
A simple answer would be yes or no.
It is the case that contained within the question are certain assumptions about what the Belfast Agreement does or does not require, which are contested.
So is it your contention that it's possible for the United Kingdom to leave the EU without a deal on the 31st of October, and that everybody who matters in Ireland will accept that the Irish border is continuing to operate entirely in keeping with both the letter and the spirit of the peace deal? Is that your contention? Can I say that it might be worrying to people in Northern Ireland?
No. I think that
if you can't give a definite yes to that, then
no. Well, I think the key point there is it's not for me to determine who everyone is.
You're the Minister for No Deal Planning.
No, it's not for me to determine everyone who, in your terms, matters in Ireland. And then the second thing is that, again, the history of politics in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland is one of open debate over the course of the last decade or two about how the Belfast Agreement can be built on and the shape of the institutions that can underpin peace. It's an important, live and sensitive debate, and while I completely understand the argument behind your line of questioning, very respectable, these are delicate matters which would require a more detailed and thoughtful response than a simple yes or no.
Mr. Chairman, Minister, I mean, one of the groups of people who matter, probably not the Scottish National Party in Northern Ireland, of course, is the unionist population.
Indeed.
It's the majority population in Northern Ireland, and of course in protecting the Belfast Agreement. One of the central points about the Belfast Agreement is the principle of consent.
Exactly.
And the withdrawal agreement as it currently stands does not coincide with the principle of consent because it would change our constitutional status. So I'm glad that the government is actually looking for a way around. However, there's good news about the Irish border and the free flow across the Irish border and the honouring of that part of the Belfast Agreement. That there should be that cooperation can continue across the border, because the Irish government, in fact I think the Taoiseach yesterday indicated that they would not be, and they are now conclusive on this, they will not be putting any checkpoints along the border, but will have other means of monitoring trade across the border. What discussions have you had with the Irish government as to the practical ways in which they intend to do that, especially since they have made it quite clear they intend to collect tariffs on goods which come from Northern Ireland in the Irish Republic?
Well, you put your finger on a number of important points. The first one is that across the unionist community, including people who vote for parties that are described as non-aligned but who are supporters of the union, there has been concern that if the backstop were in operation, that there would be laws operating in Northern Ireland which Northern Ireland's elected representatives could not alter, and that creates a particular problem with the consent principle in the Belfast Agreement, never mind any other principles. And that is not everyone agrees with that, but it is a widespread view, certainly amongst the unionist community, and not restricted to one particular party. That is an important point to acknowledge. The second point is that there is a tension, as you quite rightly point out, between the EU protecting the integrity of its whole single market, which would, if you took it at its most rigid, mean checks at the border, and the Irish government's desire, absolutely, which I applaud, to avoid checks at the border. Now, I talked, in this current role, I have not talked to representatives of the Republic of Ireland government about what might happen in the event of a no-deal situation. I mean, no, other than a cordial and friendly meeting with the ambassador a couple of weeks ago. And to be fair to the Republic of Ireland, detailed negotiations have to go through the Commission. Member States have accepted that. It has been the case that in my previous role, I talked to Michael Creed as Minister about certain specific questions that relate to food. I hope it will be the case that without going into negotiations, that we can have more conversations with the Republic of Ireland, and not just with ministers, but with others operationally, about making sure that we can achieve the situation that we would both want, which is the minimum amount of friction.
And this is the point which I find a bit strange, and I hope that you will, in your meetings with the Irish government, push this. The Irish government are insisting that they want to have as normal relationships between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, and as normal relationships on trade between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic as possible. Now, if they have already, I presumably they have, if they're making announcements of no border posts, if they've already got in place or are putting in place or planning to put in place means of monitoring trade across the border which ensure that free flow without points, do you not accept that at least the very least they can do is to share with our government how that will operate, so that in turn that can be then shared with exporters from Northern Ireland, the Irish Republic, so that they know what to expect. And it seems rather strange to me that you're saying the UK government is still in the dark as to what these arrangements are going to be.
The more cooperation, the better. We know less than we'd like, and that's partly because of the Commission's way of operating, rather than any individual decision by any politician in the Republic.
So that will be an issue which is going. Can I just ask another issue then about the cross-border trade? The Irish government has said that they intend fully to collect all taxes on trade across the border. The tariff regime which the government has published to date would have no taxes being imposed on goods coming from the Irish Republic into Northern Ireland.
Yep.
And of course that does cause some concern to the agricultural industry and other industries in Northern Ireland, that on one hand the goods we sell to the Republic will be taxed, and some of them quite a high rate, whilst the Republic will have free access into the Northern Ireland market without taxes. In the review of the tariff regime, will that be an issue which the government will be addressing, especially if the Irish government are saying it is perfectly possible and they've got means of collecting those taxes across the border without causing any infrastructure to be put in place?
I'm conscious of those arguments. We have no intention of collecting tariffs on goods going from the Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland, but I should also say that if we did leave without a deal, then we would have tariffs on east-west trade, and that would have, and I would not want to see this, but that would definitely have a significant effect on the Republic of Ireland's agri-food sector. And so, in the event of no deal, I think the Republic would bear that in mind.
Well, if it is a case that goods can enter Northern Ireland, albeit if they leave Northern Ireland will be taxed, that does place producers in Northern Ireland at a disadvantage. Has the government any plans to compensate Northern Ireland producers for the fact that there will be that part of the United Kingdom where there can be the free flow of goods with no tariffs imposed on them, and therefore Northern Irish producers being placed at a disadvantage with producers from the Republic?
Absolutely, and we are giving active consideration both to the needs specifically of the agri-food sector in Northern Ireland and the wider Northern Ireland economy. We're very conscious of that.
Okay. Just a couple of final points from me, Mr. Gove. Did I hear you correctly? You said a moment ago that no tariffs would be collected on goods moving from the Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland.
Yes.
Now, But you said they would apply if they were moving, say, from the Republic of Ireland to Holyhead?
Yes.
So how is that allowable under WTA rules?
It is the case that there is a specific exemption that is allowable, and the Attorney General has advised the government that the specific factors that pertain in Northern Ireland could mean that we could have an exemption for a period.
Does that have to be applied for, the exemption, or we can just apply it unilaterally?
I would have to return to explain to you in detail, having revisited the legal advice, exactly the provision.
I think if you could write
applies.
to us, that would be jolly helpful. Is the government planning to introduce direct rule in Northern Ireland in the event of no deal?
We are trying as hard as we can to do everything we can in order to restore the executive in Northern Ireland.
I know that, but in the absence of an executive, because you did say to Sylvia Herman in March of this year, talking about the current situation with no executive, it would be difficult to sustain in the uniquely challenging context of a no-deal Brexit. That would include the real possibility of imposing a form of direct rule. Will that be necessary if the executive is not re-established?
It is a possibility,
right.
But I would not. But I think it's important to say that Northern Ireland Civil Service are doing a fantastic job. But there are certain, and there is guidance which enables them to act with a fair degree of discretion. But it is the case that the Northern Ireland Civil Service and others would want to have ministerial direction in certain circumstances. But I won't go into what those circumstances would be now, because these are necessarily sensitive matters.
Is it the case that parliamentary authority for the civil service to take decisions in relation to Northern Ireland runs out in the middle of October and would have to be either renewed or replaced by direct rule in order to provide the ministerial input you've just referred to?
Again, it is my understanding that the terms of the EEFA bill are such that there would need to be some method of renewing that authority, or indeed some method of replacing it with ministerial direction. Yes.
Are you going to publish Operation Yellowhammer, the report?
What I hope to do is more than that. What I'd like to do is to make sure that we have a Yellowhammer, once we've done the proper revision and the kicking of the tyres, alongside a publication which details the actions that the government has taken to inform and mitigate people, inform people of the consequences and allow people to see the mitigations that we've put in place, so people can make a proper judgment about the changes they need to make, what government has done, whether that's enough, and whether it meets the need outlined in a reasonable worst-case scenario.
Okay, and can I just ask on a specific question, will that include an assessment that has been made of capacity at Portsmouth in particular,
yes,
in the event of no deal,
yes,
and the extent to which that might affect medical supplies?
Yes, and it's a very... I was going to say a very good point. All your points are good. What I mean is, it's a very important point because previous Yellowhammer scenarios had not looked at other ports other than the short straits in the degree of detail required. The Border Delivery Group have asked specifically for that, and without preempting what the content will be, absolutely.
So does that suggest that there are concerns about capacity at Portsmouth?
No, it suggests that, in fact, it doesn't suggest, it is the case that we wanted and officials wanted to be even more robust and to ask some questions. I won't editorialise, but the information about Portsmouth will be there. People have an opportunity to make a judgment about it. It is, in my view, at this case, not the case that what is revealed gives us any additional cause for concern.
But since we don't know what your cause of concern was previously...
Well, cause of concern is that Portsmouth was a priority port when it came to making sure that medical supplies arrived in the UK. Now, obviously, as I think I said in the House, our first aim is to ensure minimum friction at the straits. Secondly, maritime freight. Thirdly, air freight if necessary.
Mr. Gove, you've been extreme... Well, since it related to Northern Ireland, yes, Sammy, just very quickly.
Can I just ask, Minister, in light of what the Chairman has asked you about the consequences of no deal and there's no existence of the Assembly, if you do intend to continue with the situation where tariffs will not be collected across the Northern Ireland-Irish border, And you do intend to put some compensation arrangement in to support producers who will be affected by that. What's the mechanism for, first of all, devising that compensation scheme and administering it if you're saying that currently civil servants in Northern Ireland will have no powers to, don't have the powers to do that? Will it be done on a national basis, or does it require direct rule for that to be put in place?
It need not require direct rule for additional funding to be put in place, but there are constraints on what civil servants can do anyway. But there are also things that the UK government can do to supplement what Northern Ireland civil service do as well.
Okay, that's very helpful. Mr. Gove, thank you very much for coming today. You've been very generous with your time and appreciate it. And typically you've answered all of the questions that have been put to you. We may see you again, depends on what happens, or done. There we go.